when it comes to, and I want to get back to the broader topic of people with disabilities having relationships, when it comes to being comfortable with yourself, comfortable enough to try to pursue a relationship, and there are a lot of pitfalls. Ethically speaking, how does that work when people with disabilities are trying to pursue a relationship and they, sometimes they might not pick the right person, or we know that people with disabilities are extremely vulnerable to all kinds of abuse. So thinking about the ethics and the philosophical thought about around this, what does philosophy bring to the table in thinking about relationships for people with disabilities?
So one of the issues is consent.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, when you have someone who might have a lower degree of understanding of everything that's going on around them, it's a lot harder to determine whether they have consented to something. It's also a lot harder for them to have consented to it. So depending on the degree of disability going on, that's certainly an issue. And there have been criminal cases where people who are convinced that someone has communicated consent to them have been determined by a court not to have done so, and they went to prison for it.
But we also, I think we also can't assume, because I've seen it the other way as well, that we assume that disabled people, especially those who are either intellectually disabled, nonverbal, developmentally disabled, etc., we can't assume that they do not have the capacity for consent, because that limits them from normal, intimate, romantic, sexual relationships. So we've seen it both ways.
Well, I think we can say that about certain people.
Yes.
So obviously, if someone is at a point where their thoughts are very incoherent or something like that, right, after several strokes or something like that,
Yes.
and it's very easy for someone to take advantage of them. That's a very different case.
Yes.
Than someone who expresses consent, but you might be concerned about whether they really know what they're getting into, right? And that's a very different case from someone who has a very good understanding of
Hang on, say that again, because your audio broke up.
Has something understanding of.
Think about children. So we have consent laws for children, and they usually are just some age, right? And I know, in New York, there's this kind of transitional age range where it's 17 for consenting, but if we're within a certain number of years of the other party, then the age is no longer a reason to say it's not consent. There may be other reasons, but age is no longer a reason to say it's not legally consent. So, well, actually, I think it legally is not consent, but it's an affirmative defense against the crime, because the other person is close enough in age that it's sort of like self-defense, which means you still did commit the homicide, but it's no one can hold you as a criminal because of it. So
the first party can't consent, but then the person who would be found guilty can't consent either.
Well, no, that's not true, because they could be 18.
Yeah.
So an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old, say, the 16-year-old can't consent, but it's not a crime that you could accuse an 18-year-old of, because they're close enough in age that it counts like self-defense.
Yeah.
The law is a little weird there. But magically suddenly at 18, at 17 in New York, at 18 in some states, at 16 in some states, whatever age it is, magically suddenly when you switch over there, you suddenly are able to consent, right? And of course, that's not how it really works, right? No one really thinks that suddenly you're now able to consent when you weren't able to a few seconds earlier. It's something that comes gradually. It's something that is not clear. It's something that is difficult to determine sometimes, and that kind of thing. And that is so in cases where there are not disabilities. So obviously disabilities are just going to further complicate that.
Mm.
There are plenty of cases where there are no disabilities, where the question of whether someone consents is not easy to determine. And for example, there might be a legal blood alcohol limit that says if you're above that, then you're not consenting. If you're below it, then you are. But what if there are other, I mean, there's no definition of what counts as impairment with other things that might impair you. For example, lack of sleep, right? Or whatever, right? There's all sorts of things that might, in some ways, make it less likely that you are making rational choices, right? And this is true for everyone. So obviously, those are going to be factors that are there. When you're talking morally rather than legally, legally we got laws, and sometimes it's just by law it's not consent, and sometimes it's by law that you can't say that. You'd have to say other things.
I appreciate that you bring up the issue of consent and legal age of consent, because that brings us to next the criminalization of people with disabilities and their relationships. There are cases where, for one reason or another, a person with a disability does not have any control over their life. They don't have any control over what kinds of relationships that they can have. And when they find themselves at a stage where, actually, you know what, I think I do want to have a relationship with this person, I want to have an intimate relationship with this person, then the law turns up and says, actually, no, you can't consent to having a relationship. You cannot enter into a relationship. And if you do, the person that you've entered into the relationship with is now a criminal and a sexual predator.
Yep. Regardless of opinions on Britney Spears, she is not necessarily disabled, and certainly not in the ways that would often cause this sort of conservatorship, but she is a perfect example of a situation where someone is controlling her life, her relationships, and her decisions,
Mm-hmm.
and she's not allowed to make choices for herself. And
Yeah.
potentially, I'm not sure of this, but I would assume that because she's the one who isn't able to consent because her conservator has to for some reason, then anyone she would want to be in a relationship with, but the conservator is thinking, no, that's not the best idea for you, even in order to control a person, would be criminalized, would be considered a sexual offender.
And so for people with disabilities, then, especially those who their someone has established guardianship for them and has ultimate control over pretty much all the decisions, this is a barrier to them having relationships of all kinds, because they don't get to control, or they don't get to choose who they want to interact with and how they want to interact with them. So that's a legal and a moral issue there with, is it right to kind of step in this way and prevent people with disabilities from having a full range of relationships?